when a woman showed up to Canada's most prestigious architectural innovation competition carrying rolled blueprints, held together with a rubber band and a 7-year-old boy clutching her sleeve. Nobody in that Vancouver convention hall expected what those drawings contained. A single mother, widowed and working out of a converted garage in Sudbury, Ontario, was about to present a sustainable housing design that would make firms with million-dollar rendering software look like they'd been thinking too small. But this isn't just about a building. It's about a woman who turned catastrophic loss into something that could shelter hundreds of families, who drafted plans by lamplight after her son fell asleep, who refused to disappear quietly into grief when the easier thing would have been to let it swallow her whole. What happened next didn't just change her life. It changed what the industry believed was possible. The registration volunteer at the main entrance of the Vancouver Convention Center didn't bother softening her expression. She looked at the rolled tubes under the woman's arm, at the boy pressing close to her hip, and said, with the particular efficiencies of someone who had processed 100 participants that morning and found this one confusing, the professional portfolio submission was due digitally 3 weeks ago. Are you a student entry? Hazel Drummond set her registration packet on the table without hurrying. No. Independent submission, open category, confirmed February 14th. The volunteer checked her screen, checked it again, and her expression shifted from efficient to something closer to bewildered. She printed a lanyard badge and slid it across without further comment. The badge read Drummond Hazel, Independent, open category. Her son Callum read it upside down from where he stood. He was 7, with her same dark eyes and a winter coat he'd grown into at the shoulders but not yet at the wrists. Does it say we're in? He asked. We're in, Hazel said, looping the lanyard around her neck. The main hall was the kind of space that made you feel the weight of other people's money. Architectural firms had brought display walls, illuminated models, tablets running animated fly-throughs of gleaming towers and mixed-use developments. The Canadian Institute of Architecture's annual Innovation Prize drew the country's top firms every March, and this year's theme, Affordable Sustainable Housing for Northern Climates, had brought out submissions from Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, and Montreal, all backed by serious capital and serious credentials. Hazel's display space was table 7, near the back corner. She had 45 minutes before judging began. She unrolled her drawings and weighted the corners with the small river stones she'd carried from home specifically for this purpose, because she'd known there wouldn't be an easel. Callum sat in the chair beside her and opened his backpack to find his book. He had learned in the particular way children learn the unspoken rules of difficult situations, not to ask questions when his mother was setting up. There would be time for questions later. The look started early. An associate from a Toronto firm paused while walking past, glanced at the hand-drawn plans, and kept moving without breaking stride. 2 women in matching branded blazers stopped at the edge of Hazel's table, looked at the drawings, looked at each other, and one of them said something quietly that made the other one smile. Hazel noticed. She always noticed. She had simply gotten very good at choosing not to react. She was adjusting the elevation drawing when she became aware of someone standing at the end of her table who hadn't moved on. The woman was around 40, with the kind of posture that came from spending years as the most confident person in any given room. Her name badge read Pierce, Dorothy, CEO, Vantage Built. Vantage Built was one of the 3 largest residential construction firms in Canada. Dorothy Pierce had been profiled in Report on Business twice in the past 4 years. She wore charcoal wool and held a coffee from the convention center's executive lounge, and she was studying Hazel's drawings with an expression that Hazel couldn't immediately classify. Hand-drawn, Dorothy said. Not a question, an observation. Yes, Hazel said. Open category, independent submission. Dorothy read the table marker. Are these to scale? 1 to 50 on the main drawings, 1 to 20 on the detail sections. Dorothy set down her coffee and leaned in slightly, which was not what Hazel had expected. Most people who stopped asked one question, got a sense of what they were looking at, and moved on to the next display. Dorothy Pierce was actually looking. This roof assembly, she said, pointing to the cross-section. What are you doing here at the junction? Hazel explained. The thermal break she'd designed used a compressed agricultural fiber panel, a byproduct of Northern Ontario flax processing, fitted within a modified steel clip she'd had a local fabricator prototype for her. The assembly eliminated the thermal bridging that defeated most affordable housing attempts in cold climates. The materials cost less than conventional insulation systems and produced a fraction of the embodied carbon. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you get the flax panel?" I contacted the processing cooperative in Hearst. They've been trying to find uses for the byproduct for 6 years. Nobody in construction had approached them. Something crossed Dorothy's face, not the polite interest Hazel had expected to manage all day, something sharper. Who fabricated the clip? A shop in Sudbury. Owen Pellerin. He machined it to my spec. You have load testing? Table 3 of the technical package. Dorothy stood up straight and looked at Hazel properly for the first time. Hazel met her eyes and waited. I'm going to be direct with you, Dorothy said. The judging panel for this category includes 2 of my industry colleagues and a federal housing representative. When they get to your table, they're going to see hand-drawn plans submitted by an independent from Northern Ontario, and they are going to have to work hard not to dismiss it before they finish their coffee. She paused. That's not a criticism. It's a reality. I'm telling you because your thermal assembly is the most genuinely novel detail I've seen in this competition in 4 years, and you deserve to know what you're walking into. It was the last thing Hazel had expected her to say. Why are you telling me this? Hazel asked. Dorothy picked up her coffee. Because I got into this industry to build things that matter, and I've spent the last decade mostly building things that profit. She glanced at Callum, who was reading with complete absorption, apparently indifferent to the entire exchange. Is that your son? Yes. Did he come because you needed childcare or because you wanted him here? Both, Hazel said honestly. Dorothy nodded once, as though that answer had confirmed something. Then she walked away toward the east wing where the major firms had their displays, and Hazel stood at her table for a moment, not quite sure what had just happened. Was she nice? Callum asked without looking up from his book. I'm not sure yet, Hazel said. Callum accepted this and turned a page. The judging panel arrived at table 7 at 11:20. 3 people, a senior architect from the RXC, a representative from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and a partner from a Calgary firm named Sutherland Plus Cross, who Hazel recognized from the program. His name was Terrence Bateman, and he had designed 2 of the most photographed residential towers in Western Canada. He looked at Hazel's table, the way people look at something that doesn't belong where it is. The RA judge, a woman named Dr. Frances Achaby, picked up the technical package and began reading immediately. The CMHC representative, a man who introduced himself as Gordon Silk, crouched slightly to look at the plan drawings at their actual level rather than peering down at them. Bateman stayed standing and asked the first question. These drawings are hand-produced. Yes, Hazel said. The competition guidelines recommend BIM-formatted digital submissions for technical review. The guidelines say recommended, not required. Independent submissions are permitted in any legible format. Bateman glanced at his colleagues. Silk was still reading. Achaby had reached the thermal assembly section. Mrs. Drummond, Bateman said, with the precision of someone choosing words carefully, this category is specifically designed to encourage innovation from established firms working at scale. An independent submission, while permitted, doesn't quite fit the spirit of, the theme is affordable, sustainable housing for northern climates, Hazel said. Her voice was level. She had practiced this particular conversation in her kitchen at midnight for 3 months. My submission addresses that theme with original material sourcing, original thermal detailing, and a unit cost projection that comes in 42% below the provincial average for comparable construction. I'm happy to walk you through any section. Silk looked up from the technical package. The flax panel. You've actually tested this assembly? Thermal resistance testing was done at Laurentian University's Civil Engineering Lab. Results are on page 11. Load testing was conducted at the fabrication shop with a licensed structural engineer certifying the results, page 14. Silk turned to page 11, then page 14. His expression changed in the particular way that people's expressions change when numbers are better than they expected. Acheeb set the package down and looked at Hazel directly. How long did this take you to develop, the thermal system? About 2 years. The full design? Closer to 3. Were you working in a firm during that time? No. I left practice when my husband died. I've been independent since then. The 3 judges looked at her. The silence had a texture to it. I'm sorry for your loss, Achaby said, and she sounded like she meant it. Thank you. Bateman cleared his throat. We'll complete our review, and you'll hear from the panel by end of day. He said it with the tone of someone managing expectations downward, and Hazel heard it clearly for what it was. She thanked them, and they moved to the next table. She stood very still for a moment, then turned to check on Callum. He had given up on the book and was watching her. How did it go? He asked. 2 out of 3 were listening, she said. That's something. He considered this. Is 2 out of 3 enough? She didn't know. She told him the honest version of that, which was that she wasn't sure, and he nodded like that was an acceptable answer and went back to his book. Hazel spent the lunch break in the East Wing, walking the other displays. She did it partly to understand her competition, and partly because standing at her own table for 3 hours was making her feel like an exhibit. The major firm's submissions were technically sophisticated in ways that made her chest tighten: illuminated scale models, animated climate simulations. One firm from Montreal had brought an actual material sample wall, a full 6x4 panel demonstrating their proprietary insulation system, mounted on a display frame that must have weighed 200 kilograms. She had river stones and rubber bands. But she made herself look at each submission carefully, because she had always believed that understanding what other people built was how you learned whether your own thinking was actually original or just unfamiliar. By the time she'd completed the circuit, she was reasonably confident her thermal assembly was genuinely different. Not because her materials were fancier, because she'd asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. She found a bench near the windows where Callum could eat his sandwich and watch the harbor, and she sat beside him and ate the other half of hers and let herself feel, for a few minutes, just how tired she was. 3 years. She had spent 3 years on those drawings. The first year after Franklin died was something she still couldn't fully account for. She remembered it in flashes: Callum starting grade 1, the insurance policy that covered the mortgage but not much else, the consulting work she'd picked up to pay the rest of the bills, and underneath all of it, the design problem she'd set herself because she needed something with rules. Something where correct was a real category. Franklin had grown up in a house with walls so poorly insulated that the family put newspaper behind the baseboards in January. He used to say that the gap between Canadian winters and Canadian housing was a policy failure that engineers kept pretending was an economic inevitability. Hazel had spent the 3 years since his funeral trying to prove he was right about the economics being wrong. She hadn't told the judges that part. It wasn't their business. "Mom," Callum said, around a mouthful of sandwich, "that lady with the gray coat keeps looking over here." Hazel glanced up. Dorothy Pierce was standing near the coffee station across the lobby, and she was indeed looking at them. When she noticed Hazel looking back, she crossed the floor. "May I?" she said, gesturing at the bench. Hazel moved her bag and Dorothy sat. There was a brief adjustment period during which Dorothy seemed to be figuring out how to begin. "I want to apologize," Dorothy said, "for what I said this morning about the panel dismissing your work. I framed it as information, but it was unkind. You didn't need me to walk up to your table and tell you the game was stacked. You already knew." "I did know," Hazel agreed. "I've been watching the judging rounds from the East Corridor. Bateman is going to recommend against advancing you. He's already talked to 2 other panelists. He's describing your submission as insufficiently developed for scale consideration." Hazel felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprise, just the specific weight of having a fear confirmed. "What about Achebe and Silk?" "Silk is pushing back. Achebe is persuadable, but she defers to Bateman on technical questions because he's the architect of record on the panel, and she's the housing policy specialist." Dorothy looked at her hands for a moment. "I don't sit on the judging panel. I have no formal authority here. But I am on the prize committee, which means I can request a technical review addendum before final scores are submitted. I can ask Bateman to justify his position in writing against specific performance benchmarks rather than general readiness." "Why would you do that?" Dorothy was quiet long enough that Hazel thought she might not answer. "My father was a carpenter," Dorothy said finally. "Not a designer, not a contractor. A Finnish carpenter who worked for other people his whole life. He had notebooks full of ideas for joinery methods, structural details, things he'd figured out from 30 years of putting his hands on other people's problems. He tried to show them to the company he worked for. Twice. Both times he was told that carpenters don't design systems, engineers do." She paused. "He died at 61, still carrying those notebooks. I have them in a box in my office." Callum, who had been listening with the particular stillness of a child who knows adults are saying something important, said quietly, "What was in the notebooks?" Dorothy looked at him. Her expression did something complicated. "Good things," she said. "Things that should have been built." She stood. "I'm going to request the addendum. It won't guarantee anything. But it will require Bateman to engage with your actual numbers instead of dismissing your format." She left before Hazel could find the right thing to say. Callum watched her go. "She seems sad," he said. "I think she is a little," Hazel said, "but she's still helping." "Yes," Hazel said, "she is." The afternoon session was harder to endure than the morning. Hazel stood at her table and fielded questions from attendees who ranged from genuinely curious to visibly skeptical, and she answered all of them with the same steadiness, because she had decided somewhere in the second year of working on this that she would never perform certainty she didn't feel. But she would also never perform doubt in front of people who were already looking for reasons to dismiss her. At 3:45, she overheard a conversation between two associates from a Vancouver firm, standing close enough to her table that they didn't bother lowering their voices entirely. Something about the hand drawings, something about the Northern Ontario market not being a real test of scalability, something that she processed and set aside because allowing herself to be angry right now would cost her something she needed for later. Callum heard it too. She saw his shoulders go tight. "Ignore them," she said not unkindly. "That's hard," he said. "I know. You don't have to pretend it isn't." He thought about this. Did Dad ever have people not take him seriously? Franklin had been an electrician. He had walked into rooms his entire career where the assumption was that the person with the blueprint outranked the person with the tools, and he had navigated that gap with a steadiness Hazel had spent years trying to understand and replicate. "All the time," she said. "And he kept doing good work anyway, because of us?" "Partly, and because the work was worth doing regardless." Callum looked at the plan spread across the table. "I think the work is worth doing," he said seriously. Hazel put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "I know you do. That's not nothing." The panel results were posted electronically at 5:15. Every submission could view its advancement status through the conference portal. Hazel stood at the check-in desk and pulled up her entry number on the tablet they provided. Drummond H. Independent, open cactuary, advant to final review. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time because she had prepared so completely for the other outcome that her brain was slow to accept this one. Callum was looking up at her face rather than the screen, reading her expression. "We're through?" he asked. "We're through," she said. He didn't jump or shout. He was his father's son in that way, quiet about the things that mattered most. He just took her hand and held it, and she squeezed his fingers, and they stood there for a moment in the busy lobby of the convention center while people moved around them, and it was enough. That evening, Hazel sat on the floor of their hotel room with her drawings spread around her, going through the final presentation notes she'd prepared. Callum was asleep by 8:30, worn out in the way children get when they've been carrying adult tension all day without the vocabulary to name it. She called her sister back in Sudbury, who answered on the second ring and listened to the whole day in order, and then said, "Franklin would have wanted to see the thermal detail in person." "I know," Hazel said. "He would have had 17 questions about the clip, at least 17. After she hung up, she sat for a while without looking at the drawings. The hotel room had the specific quiet of unfamiliar places, which was different from the quiet of home, and she didn't try to fill it. She thought about Dorothy Pierce's father and his notebook sitting in a box in a CEO's office. She thought about what it meant to carry someone else's unrealized ideas through your own life, how that kind of inheritance could drive you or hollow you out depending on which way you turned it. She had turned hers into drawings, rolled up, held with rubber bands, carried across 600 kilometers to a table in the back corner of a room full of people who had not expected her to be there. The final judging was scheduled for 9 the next morning. Hazel set 2 alarms and was awake before either of them. The final presentation room was smaller and more formal than the exhibition hall, a rectangular table, 6 chairs on one side for the expanded panel, 1 chair on the other for the presenter. The RAIC had brought in 2 additional judges for the final round, including a professor from the University of Waterloo's architecture faculty who had published on northern housing typologies, and a representative from the Federal Climate Infrastructure Fund. Hazel carried her drawings into the room and unrolled them on the table provided. She had 1 hour. Bateman was there, as she'd expected. He sat at the end of the panel with the posture of someone who had already made up his mind but understood he was required to go through the motions. Achaby was next to him, and then Silk, and then the 2 additions, and at the far end, observing as a prize committee member rather than a judge, Dorothy Pierce. Dorothy gave Hazel one brief look when she entered. Not encouraging, not warning. "Just present," Hazel began. She had given this presentation in her kitchen at 2 in the morning so many times that she knew exactly where her voice wanted to go flat and had built specific language to prevent it. She walked them through the site analysis for Northern Ontario housing stock, the thermal performance gap between code compliance and actual winter comfort, the supply chain reality for remote communities where expensive proprietary materials arrived damaged or overpriced or not at all. She explained why she'd gone to Hearst, why the Flax Cooperative had said yes immediately, why Owen Pellerin had spent 4 Saturday afternoons in his shop with her getting the clip geometry right. She showed them the test data. She showed them the cost projections, which she'd had verified by a quantity surveyor she'd found through the engineering faculty at Laurentian. She talked about the house types the system was designed for, not prestige developments, not urban infill, but the scattered housing stock of northern Ontario towns, where families were space heating with electric baseboards, because that was what was there, and the provincial grid was paying for it in both dollars and emissions. When she finished, she was 12 minutes under her time limit, which meant there was room for questions. The Waterloo professor went first, and her questions were technical and serious, and Hazel answered all of them. The federal representative asked about Indigenous community applications, and Hazel spoke to that carefully, because she had thought about it and also about the limits of what a non-Indigenous designer should presume to design without genuine partnership, and she said so directly. Silk asked 3 follow-up questions about procurement logistics. Achibi asked about maintenance and life cycle cost. Then Bateman spoke. Mrs. Drummond, I want to be clear that I respect the technical work you've done here. The thermal testing is credible. The cost analysis is more rigorous than I expected. He paused. My concern is delivery capacity. An independent designer without construction industry relationships, without established supplier contracts, without the project management infrastructure to bring this to a pilot phase. The innovation, however legitimate, remains theoretical. The prize committee needs to feel confident that what they're funding can actually be built. Hazel had prepared for this argument too. She had an answer ready, but before she could give it, Dorothy Pierce, from her position at the end of the table, said, Terrence, she has already built it. Bateman turned. The thermal assembly has been prototyped and tested, Dorothy said. The fabricator exists. The material supplier exists. She has a quantity surveyor's sign-off on the cost projections and university lab certified performance data. She let a pause land. The usual barriers you're describing, relationships, infrastructure, capacity, those are things that prize funding exists to provide. That's the point of the prize. Bateman looked at her for a moment. The prize is designed to advance work from firms with a track record of delivery. The open category guidelines do not specify that, Dorothy said, and I think we both know it. The room was quiet. Achibi said to no one in particular, the testing data is genuinely compelling. Silk had already turned back to the technical package. Page 14, he said, mostly to himself. These load numbers are better than the Montreal submission. Hazel stood at the presenter's chair and did not allow herself to feel anything yet, because feeling things too early was how you lost your footing. The panel deliberated for 45 minutes. Hazel and Callum waited in the lobby. He had found a spot by a large window overlooking the water and was drawing in his sketchbook, something he did when he was nervous and didn't want to admit it. What are you drawing? She asked. The clip, he said. The one Mr. Pellerin made. I'm trying to remember the shape. She looked at his drawing. He'd gotten the basic geometry approximately right, which pleased her more than she could have said. Dorothy came out of the deliberation room first. She crossed the lobby to where they were sitting. I can't tell you the result, she said, not officially, but I want to say something. Hazel looked at her. Whatever happens in there, you should know that you changed the conversation. 2 of those judges are going to go back to their offices and think differently about material sourcing in cold climate construction. The federal representative is already talking about whether the procurement model you've described could apply to the Northern Housing Initiative. That doesn't disappear regardless of what the vote says. But the vote matters, Hazel said. The vote matters, Dorothy agreed. I'm just saying both things are true. Callum looked up from his sketchbook. Is it close? Dorothy glanced at him. Yes, she said. It's close. She went back inside. Callum turned to his mother. If we don't win, we go home, Hazel said. I keep the consulting work. We keep the drawings. We find another way to build it. And if we do win? She had allowed herself to think about this only in the most practical terms. The prize money, what it would cover, what it would make possible. The emotional version of winning was something she'd kept behind a door in her head, because opening it prematurely was dangerous. Then we figure out the next steps together, she said. He leaned against her shoulder. They sat like that without talking, while the harbor moved outside the window, and people came and went through the lobby, and Callum's sketchbook rested open on his knees with his drawing of Owen Pellerin's clip approximately right. The door to the deliberation room opened at 11:45. All 6 judges came out. Bateman was expressionless, Silk was not. Achebe walked directly to where Hazel was sitting and said, Mrs. Drummond, could you come with us, please? Hazel stood. Callum started to rise, and she put her hand on his shoulder. Wait here. Mom, I'll be 2 minutes. She followed the panel back into the room where the lead judge, Dr. Achebe, stopped at the head of the table and turned around. The panel has reached a decision, Achebe said. In the open category, the Canadian Institute of Architecture Innovation Prize is awarded to Hazel Drummond, independent, for her Northern Thermal Assembly System. The decision was not unanimous, but it was a majority. She extended her hand. Congratulations. The prize includes $40,000 in project development funding, a 12-month mentorship arrangement with RIAC technical advisors, and facilitated introductions to federal housing procurement contacts. We believe this work should be built. Hazel shook Achibi's hand, and then Silk's, and then the federal representatives, who told her she'd be receiving a call from his office next week. Bateman extended his hand last. His grip was firm and brief. The data was stronger than I expected, he said. I want you to know I'll be watching how this develops. It wasn't warm, but it was honest, and she respected that. She went back into the lobby. Callum was standing up because he had been unable to stay seated. He searched her face. She nodded. He crossed the distance between them at speed, and she caught him and held him the way she had the night Franklin died, just holding on while the world reorganized itself into a different shape around them. We did it, he said, muffled against her shoulder. Your dad's thermal gap, she said. We closed it. She felt him laugh a little, wet at the edges, and she held on for another moment before letting him step back. Dorothy was standing near the corridor entrance, watching. When Hazel looked over, she gave a single, small nod and then turned and walked back toward the exhibition hall, leaving them to it. The weeks that followed moved in a way Hazel hadn't anticipated. The RAIC announcement generated coverage she hadn't prepared for. A piece in Canadian Architect, a segment on CBC Radio 1's afternoon program, an inquiry from a Northern Ontario housing authority that had been trying to solve the same thermal problem for 11 years through conventional channels. Owen Pellerin called to say he'd had 4 inquiries about the clip in 1 week, and could he list her project in his portfolio. She said yes, of course, and then sat at her kitchen table for a few minutes after hanging up, just letting that land. The prize money paid for the intellectual property work her lawyer had been urging her to do for 2 years. It paid for a proper set of digital documentation of the drawings, which she'd been doing by hand for entirely practical reasons. She hadn't been able to afford the software. It left enough to fund a pilot project in partnership with a small housing nonprofit in Timmins who'd seen the CBC piece and emailed within 48 hours. Dorothy Pierce called her 6 weeks after the competition, not through an assistant, directly. I wanted to let you know, Dorothy said, that Vantage Built is interested in discussing a licensing arrangement, not acquisition. Licensing. You keep the IP. We manufacture at scale and pay you a royalty per unit. I want you to have independent legal counsel review any terms before we talk specifics, and I want you to know that if you'd rather work with someone else, I will understand. Hazel leaned back in her chair. Outside, Callum was in the backyard, kicking a soccer ball against the fence with the patient persistence of someone working on a problem. Why are you doing this way? She asked. You could have a much simpler conversation with me and probably get a better deal. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Because my father spent his whole career being given the simpler conversation, she said. I know what that costs. They talked for another 20 minutes. No commitments, no signatures. Just the beginning of something. After she hung up, Hazel sat for a while at the kitchen table that had been her desk for 3 years, the one with the scratch near the left edge, where she dragged a metal rule across it during a frustrating night in the first winter after Franklin died. The drawings were in the other room now, digitized and filed, but she kept one rolled copy in the tube by the door. She wasn't sure why, maybe because it was the version that had gone to Vancouver with riverstones holding its corners down, and that felt like something worth keeping. Callum came in from outside, flushed from the cold, dropping his boots at the door. Was that the lady from Vancouver? He asked. Yes, the sad one who helped. She's working on being less sad, I think, Hazel said. People do that. He got a glass of water and drank half of it. Is she going to help build the houses? Maybe. We'll see. He thought about this. Then, Dad would have had questions about scaling. He would have had so many questions, Hazel agreed. Callum smiled. It was the smile he'd inherited from Franklin, the one that came out quiet and unhurried, and Hazel held it in her chest the way she held all the things that still arrived with his face on them. Can we work on the Timmins drawings tonight? Callum asked. You said you'd show me how to do the section cuts. She pushed back her chair. Get the pencils, she said. Let's see what we can figure out. He went to get 'em, and Hazel stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the yard where the afternoon light was going thin and blue the way Northern Ontario light did in March. The color that Franklin had always said looked like the world was holding its breath. She had spent 3 years learning to breathe inside that color, to work inside it. To believe that what she was building mattered even on the days when the evidence was thin and the doubt was loud, and the only thing keeping her at the table was the problem itself and the small, sleeping weight of a child in the next room who needed her to keep going. The evidence was less thin now. The problem was closer to solved, and the child was standing in the doorway holding a pencil case and asking if they could start. "Ready," she said, and turned away from the window.